It's a question that I've been asking for a long time. I think I was asking this question back in 2008. I know I was asking it in 2014, and I'm asking it again. Are you willing to go to war for ... Fill in the blank nation. Back then it was Lebanon, or not Lebanon, Libya. And then it was Syria. And today it's Taiwan. Are you willing to go to war over Taiwan? A recent poll shows that supposedly, for the first time in many, many years, a majority of Americans are willing to go to war to defend Taiwan from China's invasion. How many of you know how we got to this point? I'm old enough to remember made in Taiwan being a thing. Made in Japan was a thing. Made in Taiwan was a thing. Now, of course, it's made in China. There was a reason why it said made in Taiwan, because they couldn't say made in China, even though Taiwan claims to be China. And China says Taiwan is China. It's just a recalcitrant province. Way back before World War II, the communist revolution began in China with Chiang Kai-shek commanding the nationalists, or good guys, good being a relative term, with Mao Zedong commanding the communists. And the two nations were engaged in a civil war that was interrupted when Japan invaded China and used both sides to their advantage, although they had a harder time getting the nationalists to do so, but they used the communists to their advantage. They allowed the communists to actually build bases inside Japanese-held territory. Japan was never ever able to actually conquer all of China, but they conquered enough of it to make it usable to themselves. During the war, both sides, the nationalists and the communists, tolerated one another because it meant getting help from the United States and United Kingdom. And they both fought against the Japanese, and ultimately, of course, we were victorious. The Japanese were compelled to leave China. And at that point, the internal civil war between the communists led by Mao Zedong and the nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek kicked off again. The nationalists were winning the war. The nationalists were driving the communists back into the northwest section of the country. You have the whole Long March thing. You get all this stuff going on. And then there was a series of battles that ended up with the nationalists, who heavily outnumbered the communists, losing a series of battles that ultimately led to their defeat. The nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, fled to the island of Taiwan, while the communists, led by Mao Zedong, declared the People's Democratic Republic of China, standing at Tiananmen Square in Beijing. And so you had a Chinese government that the United States recognized on Taiwan, and you had a communist government in Beijing, and boy, did that start things. Eventually, the United States and Taiwan signed something called the Sino-American Mutual Defense Treaty, which is kind of a weird name. But in essence, what it said was that if China invades Taiwan, we will defend you. And theoretically, the actual wording of the treaty was that if we were ever invaded, Taiwan was going to come to our aid. Not sure that would have ever happened, but at any rate, you get the idea that we had this mutual defense pact with them that also allowed us to sell them weapons, defensive weapons, Taiwan, and we began this uneasy period in our history that's gone on now since 1949 of who's the real China? Is it Taiwan or is it mainland China? And for the better part of 30 years, from 1949 to the early 1970s, there was this, are there two Chinas? Well, we're good friends with Taiwan. Like I said, made in Taiwan was a thing. And then, in accordance with the ancient Vulcan proverb, only Nixon could go to China. President Nixon went to China and he began détente with the Chinese. And I think, I'm not critical of that in the strongest of senses. I think there was some political capital to be gained there. And more importantly, the Chinese and the Russians have never gotten along about anything. They might all be communists, but, you know, it's you know, Baptists and Catholics are all Christians, but they don't get along. Same thing. The Chinese version of communism isn't acceptable to the Russians. The Russians aren't acceptable to the Chinese. And rumors have flirted for years about major conflicts between the Soviet Union and China along the Amur River. Whether or not they're true or not, nobody knows, other than the people that are there. There may have been some playing around with that by Richard Nixon and his opening up of China and his détente with China. But as a part of that, President Carter, a few years later, decided to end the Mutual Defense Treaty. There was a clause in there that said each side could end this treaty with 1 year's notice. And President Carter's position was, hey, we're on friendly terms with the communist Chinese now, so we're no longer going to defend you, Taiwan. Not like that. This was responded to with an understanding. The Taiwan Relations Act, which has been defined as, quote, strategic ambiguity. Nobody really knows what it means. Nobody knows if the United States is going to defend Taiwan or is committed to defending Taiwan or not. We just don't know. But it did allow us to continue to sell Taiwan, quote unquote, defensive weapons, whatever that might mean. And so since 1980 and well into now, we've had this position of strategic ambiguity with Taiwan insofar as Taiwan is concerned, while China itself, mainland China, communist China, the People's Republic of China, has become more and more belligerent about we want Taiwan back. It belongs to us. And we should own it. And of course, they've made more and more saber rattling about invading Taiwan. And this all came to a head this week because over the past few weeks, over the past couple of months, China, communist China, has been sending aircraft into Taiwanese airspace to probe, annoy, threaten, however you want to look at it, the Taiwanese air defense system. Taiwan has to respond because you have to do that. You can't ignore it. And so they didn't. And the world wobbles ever closer to a potential war over Taiwan. Have you ever been to Taiwan? Have you ever seen Taiwan? Would you even know where it was if you had to find it on a map? And yet a poll now shows that Americans increasingly are supporting the idea that the United States should defend Taiwan in battle against the communist Chinese. Not sure what that means. Not sure how this functions. And the beauty of all this is that neither are the politicians. The politicians don't know what to do. Starting with Bill Clinton's 3 communiques with the communist Chinese, which might have said to communist China, yeah, we don't care about Taiwan anymore, or they might not have. Nobody is clear. It's such diplomatic language that nobody really knows what it says, other than we would, quote, gradually reduce arms sales to Taiwan. What does that mean? Nobody knows. Gradually reduce arms sales to Taiwan. In recent years, the Republicans have pushed forward what they call the 6 assurances to Taiwan. The 6 assurances essentially maintain the strategic ambiguity. We will gradually means we're not going to really do that. And we still believe that Taiwan is an independent nation or independent province or whatever you want to call it, without actually saying it's an independent country, because we can't say that. So you can't say 2 Chinas. If you say 2 Chinas, President Xi goes freaking nuts. Because they're not 2 Chinas, even though there really are. In 2021, this year, the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, reaffirms, in the language of the bill, reaffirms the 6 assurances that we've been given to Taiwan, which means that strategic ambiguity remains, and nobody really knows what that means. Except that you can't say that there's 2 Chinas, because if you say there's 2 Chinas, like I said, diplomats lose their freaking minds, and particularly communist Chinese people go, they just can't deal with that. Talk about ridiculous, but at any rate, be that as it may. There's a lot of confusion about what is Taiwan. What is it? Who is? I mean, it's an island. We know that, but is it national? Is it the National Republic of China, or is it the People's Republic of China? Is it actually a country? Is it not a country? And even President Biden is confused by all of this. He actually said a week or so ago that he and Xi, president of Communist China, had agreed to, quote, abide by the Taiwan Agreement, unquote. No, President Biden said that. But nobody knows what he's talking about because there is no Taiwan Agreement. Pardon me, what are you talking about? There is no Taiwan Agreement. And even as he was saying that, there were senators and congresspeople in Taipei on Taiwan, the Taipei is the capital of Taiwan, talking about mutual issues that the United States has with Taiwan. What are those issues? And if we're going to have those discussions, are you sure you want congresspeople doing that? Especially since it's not even bipartisan. It was just Republican congresspeople. It wasn't even diplomats. It wasn't people that are trained to do any of this stuff. It's just a bunch of congressmen who wanted to go over there and wave the flag saying, we support Taiwan. And of course, the news comes yesterday that, oh my God, there's a submarine in the Straits of Taiwan. If you're looking at the map that I'm pointing to, see this little bit of water here between Taiwan and China? There was a submarine, a Chinese submarine in there. And of course, this caused great consternation. People went BSC about, oh my God, there's a communist Chinese submarine transiting on the surface between the two. Should have raised some questions right off the bat, but of course it didn't. It was seen not as what it most likely was, but rather as a provocation. These jets are flying in. Here's the submarine. Does any of this make any sense to anybody? And that's the question you got to ask yourself. It seems more and more that we're being pushed towards a war over Taiwan with China. But why? Why would the Chinese want to push us into a war over Taiwan? Would we even respond to it? Let's say, worst case scenario. Let's say the Chinese, communist Chinese, loaded up everything they got, headed over to Taiwan, landed on the beaches, rolled in the tanks, and blitzkrieged Taiwan. What would we do? And would we even respond? I mean, sure, poll says a majority of Americans want to, or think that we should, but would you really care? Hell, would it even make the evening news? Is anything on Taiwan? Now, again, don't misunderstand what I'm saying here. Yes, there are multi-millions of people living in Taiwan who are free Chinese nationalists. But is anything else on Taiwan worth the economic devastation that a war between China and the United States over Taiwan would cause? China, their number one trading partner is the United States, right? Isn't that where Republicans are always talking about our national debt to China, blah, blah, blah. Why would China, what would they gain by pushing the United States into a war over Taiwan? I mean, they could do it, might even want to do it. But what would they gain if they did? I know we've got retired admirals sitting in front of Congress and testifying that China is going to invade Taiwan within 6 years. And we have Republican congresspeople and senators talking about how China is going to invade and all that, and they certainly might. There's a reason why they might do it. We'll get to that in just a minute. But the question merely becomes, could they even do it? I know you look at that little bit of water, you go, well, sure, Dave, they could just jump right across there, some helicopters flying in, blah, blah, blah. But a large-scale amphibious invasion that it would take to conquer Taiwan. It's one of the most complicated and difficult military operations there is in existence. It requires air and material superiority, the rapid buildup and sustainment of supplies on shores, and, this is the most important part, uninterrupted support. Remember what Eisenhower said. Amateurs study tactics, professionals study logistics. So what if you can land, maybe even take a few blocks of a city? If you can't support it, it's not going to do you any good. Go back and look at Overlord, the Normandy invasions, and consider how much work and effort went into those after the fact. The Mulberry Harbors, the need to take Cherbourg, the support factors that were involved were far more overwhelming than anything else. Any attempt to invade Taiwan would likely strain China's armed forces and invite international intervention. Well, we happen to know that we have submarines in the South China Sea, don't we? He said knowingly, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Interventions. Those stresses, combined with the complexity of urban warfare and counterinsurgency, make an amphibious invasion of Taiwan a significant political military risk. What happens if the Communist Chinese try this and it doesn't work? Theoretically, if you manage to pull this off, and by the way, President Xi has said that, quote, reabsorption, unquote, of Taiwan is a long-term goal. Even if you manage to pull it off, what does it cost you to do it? Is that worth it? Any response, hypothetically, from the United States would be questionable. The more I contemplate this, the outright invasion of Taiwan is militarily, it's a gamble. It's a huge gamble. And I don't know that the Chinese would be willing to gamble their entire economy because you would lose your number one trading partner. You would lose the country that owes you money. Do you think if the Chinese go to war with us, we're going to pay them back the money that we owe them? There's an unrealistic expectation here that's not being taken into effect. Now, that doesn't change the fact that China is saber-rattling because they want to. They know that it annoys. They know that we're going to react somehow or another. But they also know that the likelihood of themselves being able to pull it off, I mean, it's Dave's third law. The more pious someone is about something, the less likely they have anything to be pious about. In many ways, it's the same thing. The louder they are about saber rattling, the more likely it is because they can't actually do it. But would they try? Tom Clancy had a very fascinating theory that he wrote about in one of his books about warfare in modern era. And he's right. Virtually every nation since the modern era, say 1860, say 1800, Napoleon, virtually every country that has started a war in the technological age ends up losing. They lose because they don't take into account all the factors involved. And so QED, he says, starting a war is an irrational act because you are likely to lose. You are more likely to lose than you are to win. So therefore, starting a war is an act of irrationality. And you can't predict necessarily what irrational people are going to do. And that's the danger we face. China, communist China, is a communist dictatorship. And it's easy to say that, well, they're just irrational because that's what we used to say about the Soviets. No, they're crazy. Are they irrational? I mean, having a strategic goal of reabsorption of Taiwan is not the same thing as saying, yeah, we're going to do it next week. And when you're dealing with a country with the history of China, playing the long game isn't necessarily all that difficult of a thing to do. What happens if Taiwan becomes communist? Oh, that could never happen? Yeah, and Texas and Georgia could never go blue, right? Sometimes unrelated small things have huge effects. And as we sit here going, well, the vast majority of American people think we should defend China in battle. I think we need to be thinking about, do we really mean that? Number one, are we really going to need to do it? Now, no, I'm a big believer in deterrence. And I think that we probably are doing some things to deter China. They have to know that our submarines and aircraft carriers, and we keep sending ships through the Straits of China and that kind of into the South China Sea. We keep doing stuff like that because we want them to know we care. Hopefully, it's sending the right message. Hopefully that's sending the message of, this is one destroyer, this is one aircraft carrier, this is one submarine. And see how badly it's screwing you up? Now imagine if the entire United States Navy was out here, or the United States Air Force, or even the United States Army. If we parked a division of United States Army troops on Taiwan because we thought China was going to invade, do you think they'd think twice? It's just one of those things that we need to be thinking about. But like I said, sometimes small things have big effects. In our relationship with China, which we have normalized since 1972, I believe, when Nixon went over there, like I said, the Vulcan proverb, only Nixon could go to China. If we're going to choose that route, this normalization, and we're going to minimize Taiwan, and then all of a sudden we go back on that, how does that make China feel? How does that make communist China feel? I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. What I'm saying is we need to think through all the strategic implications of that. Are we really willing to go to war over Taiwan? Now, I know what you're saying because I know how conservatives think. Because I think that way sometimes. Sure, Dave, we got to defend freedom wherever we can find it. How come we didn't send troops to Hong Kong? We got to defend freedom because if we don't defend freedom, the communists will take over. And while I understand that domino theory, while I understand all that, the real question you should be asking yourself as an American, are you really willing to go to war with China over Taiwan? Because if all of a sudden you can't get cheap Chinese goods, through a supply chain, and America isn't spun up enough to start producing those things, what happens to your life? And all those cheap Chinese things that you buy at Walmart or wherever. Oh, and don't tell me, I only buy American. No, you don't. Nobody does. What happens then? What happens to your car and all those Chinese parts that are in it? If we're not really careful, we might win a war over Taiwan, but then it'll all go back to being made in Taiwan, won't it? Strategically, it's something to think about. Moving all of our manufacturing overseas might make it cheaper, which is, of course, what we like, but it doesn't make it more secure, does it? And that's what a war over Taiwan with China might end up costing us. In addition to our children, our parents, our wives, our husbands, and many, many, many billions of dollars.